From your perspective, how did this collaboration work and what was your role? Because if I recall, one of the decisions in Harare was that WLDI and yourself and Lisa particularly would continue to support the network together with the other networks.
Yes. Well, I think it was at that point that Women Law and Development International became its own thing. And the purpose of it was to support the networks in several areas. It was during the Human Rights Conference in Vienna where we had the first meeting of Women Law and Development International with a board composed of people who had been working in this area and who were there at the conference. So that was the beginning. And it was very clear that our purpose was to support the needs of the networks. And that played itself out in three areas: research, clarifying the issues and strategies, and then advocacy, and finally education and capacity building. And we can talk about each of these areas because each one of them took place in a collaborative manner, but in different ways. So we'll talk about research. The first project really undertaken as WLDI was a research project focusing on two themes: violence against women and legal literacy, because those themes had been coming up and that's the feedback we had been receiving from the regions. So we conceived this project again as a participatory research project. We reached out to people working in those areas, working in violence against women and legal literacy, awareness raising. So we brought together a core team of people who would be writing papers for the book. But the reason we had that first meeting, which lasted about a week each, was to lay out all the issues, define the term so everybody was working on the same page, and then divide the work up after people went home. And then the papers came in, and that became Freedom from Violence, Women's Strategies from Around the World. That was one product of this process. But of course, it took about a year. I mean, this was not a quick turnaround, of course. And then the other one, Legal Literacy, a Tool for Women's Empowerment. And that was really a wonderful collaborative experience. And Florence was part of it. And I think I don't know if you want to make a comment about it, but that was one of my favorite projects, actually.
Yeah, it was really interesting and important for the collaboration and for the networks, at least for WiLDAF, and I believe it was the same for CLADEM and APWLD. It was more than research. It was a time for a core group of people to listen to each other and understand the issues that we were dealing with. It was a time we were almost acting like a think tank, really analyzing, trying to go deeper into what causes this. What do you mean by legal literacy? Is it just passing on information about the law? Is it something deeper? How do you do it for it to make sense? So we talked about Paul Freire and his methods of adult literacy. We exchanged ideas in terms of those who were using paralegals, those who were using the lawyers. So I think that was one of the most I think I would, in the end, call it a think tanking exercise and team building. We really became so close because when you know each other so intimately, you've shared everything for 2 weeks. It was easier then to respond to each other in future. Request for information goes through very well. That's what I recall. And of course, the books were extremely useful. They became tools that the networks could use to complement, to understand a bit more what they need to do to be more effective in their strategies at the national level.
So thank you. I just would like to comment that before, when I talked about a methodology being part and parcel of what is women law and development, that was it. In other words, it's not just academic research, it's participatory research that engages people. So it's also network building. It's many things, but the purpose is to clarify the issues and strategies. That was kind of the term we often used. And you asked what was my role. My role obviously was convening, but it was also editing the papers and preparing an overview. So my contribution in the books was the introductory material and actually, this isn't very well known, but I was very computer. I actually laid those books out myself. I did the layout. I did have help editing to make sure we didn't have any mistakes, grammar and so forth, but actually we were able then to just give to the printer camera ready copy. So, I mean, we just did everything. And, but like I say, that was one of my favorite projects. The second area that we worked in with the overall title was advocacy. And that kind of had two parts. One was agenda setting at UN conferences. The Human Rights Conference in '93, we did some work around that. And then the Women's Conference in Beijing. We had our own NGO panels at the conference, but one of the things that came out of the Human Rights Conference was the naming of the Special Rapporteur on Violence Against Women. And the person who was named to that was Radhika Kumaraswamy, who was critical in the whole conceptualizing and founding of women law and development. And so she asked us to assist in some ways, offer what we had. And so each year we produced a kind of a paper that related to the theme that was going to be, that related to her theme that year. So the first one we did was State Responses to Domestic Violence. And I'm really proud of this little book. It has a wonderful overview, and it includes model legislation. And so that was, the research on that was actually done by the staff. We didn't do the same kind of outreach in terms of collaboration. There was a team on our staff who did this. The second one was State Responses to Rape. And then the third one was Gender Violence, the Hidden War Crime. So that was our contribution to helping set the agenda related to women's human rights in that context. The 95 Women's Conference in Beijing, that we spent like a couple of years, and that was a very collaborative process where we worked with other organizations. We tried to identify experts, people with substantive knowledge of different areas, and produced. The outcome was another book called From Basic Needs to Basic Rights. But to produce that book, we had people writing on different themes, and then we came together working very closely with Shanti in Kuala Lumpur. And we had this conference that happened. It was a few months. I think it was toward the end of '94. So the book was out by the time the conference the following year. And so that pretty much describes the kind of work that we did on the advocacy arena.
What I would like to add is that through that advocacy, the Women Law and Development networks interacted a lot and contributed to more regional and global advocacy towards the world conferences, particularly with the Vienna conference. You will recall that this is the conference where we are pushing to have a recognition of women's rights as human rights. So that wasn't a project just for the WLD networks. So we worked with basically women's rights groups, even if they were in other networks. And we also worked with broad mainstream human rights organizations because we needed them to support the inclusion of women's rights as human rights in the Vienna Declaration. So most of all the three networks had leadership in collaborating, for instance, with the Global Center at Rutgers University, led by Charlotte, to move that agenda forward. And that collaboration was very important because the groups we belonged to were bringing issues and voices from the ground to that international level advocacy. And if you recall, during the Global Tribunal, the International Tribunal in Vienna, most of the case studies were given by people, some of whom belonged to the WLD networks. I was one of those who testified during the tribunal. So that cross-fertilization of ideas and experiences, I think, contributed a lot to the advancement of the notion of women's rights as human rights. That I think a two-way process, because we brought in voices of, let's say, African women to the global level, so that the states were not just listening to international organizations, but to women from across the globe.